I now welcome representatives from Wagga Wagga City Council via video conference. For the Hansard record, could you please give your name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Councillor Dan Hayes.
Councillor Rod.
Peter Thompson, General Manager.
Daryl Woods, I'm the Council Businesses for Wagga City Council, and the airport falls under that portfolio.
Terrific, thank you. I invite you to make a brief opening statement before the committee asks questions. Do you wish to make an opening statement?
Yeah, I'm happy to do a brief summary if you would like, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Hayes.
Thank you. Look, the sort of three areas I think we were hoping to raise today, in particular about the Wagga Airport, was the lease arrangement. Currently, we lease it from the Department of Defence, which then has implications around the rent, what we can do out there, and I guess the financial future of council's role at the Wagga Airport. It also flows on to the second part, which is the challenges that has in attracting both grants from state and federal government, and also from attracting businesses to the airport to set up due to that lease arrangement. The other area is around the security requirements set by the federal government and the challenges we have in meeting those, while also, I guess, having two different airlines with two different requirements for screening, and then how we manage that in the regional area. So they're probably the three key parts. Thank you.
And if I may say something, I did send you some notes that were largely personal orientated. In addition to that, I don't think we need to concentrate on that tonight or this afternoon, because I'm sure many other witnesses have touched on those, except to say that I think the one aspect during COVID that has been sorely missing from the federal government's response is actually the support for the financial well-being of regional airports owned or operated by local government in particular, but regional airports generally. We've seen very, very many or a lot of money spent on with a functional, well-maintained operational airports to continue that standard of transport that we've experienced in the past.
Thank you, Mr. Kendall. Senator O'Neill, I believe you have questions.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thanks so much for coming on and giving us evidence about that great hub of activity for the southwest of New South Wales. Wagga is one of the key cities out west in terms of connection for trade, movement, and also for tourism in the area. So I'm very appreciative of your opening remarks. Can I just go perhaps start at the end with the comment regarding, was it Mr. Kendall?
Correct.
Thank you. With regards to the regional airports and their status, you made a claim that I think has been well borne out by correspondence to my office from regional New South Wales entities, that the financial wellbeing of airports has been essentially overlooked by the federal government in the course of the pandemic. What is the impact of that neglect, and what is the scale of recovery that's required?
Yeah, look, I think I'll throw to the General Manager for that, because he'll have those costs more significantly worked out. But of course, from my point of view, the operational aspects of an airport have to continue whether or not air traffic is passing through that airport. And of course, the income from that, particularly passenger transport or regular passenger transport, hasn't eventuated largely through COVID, and significant losses to those airports have occurred because of it. But Peter Thompson, I think, is better placed to answer it. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Senator. I can give you actual figures for last financial year and can confirm that our regional airport had a net loss of $1,083,000 last year, and our other general fund is propping that up with a loan, and no doubt the year that we're going into will be a similar result. That's the here and now. In relation to the neglect of regional airports comment and financial impact, generally, the airport for our regional centre, as well as all regional centres, is one of our key communication hubs. For us to be appealing to establish businesses and invest money, we need to be connected to other centres and other capitals. And in the case of Wagga Airport, because it's federally government owned and it's unusual for that reason, it sees itself neither supported by the federal government with grant funding, nor supported by the New South Wales with grant funding. And every year we are slipping further and further behind with that particular gateway and selling our city for that investment. Did you want me to go any further, or did you want to get to the next question?
That's very helpful, because I mean there's the particular of Wagga and the unusual position that you find yourselves in by comparison to some other regional airports. And then there's the general neglect that is across the entire sector. So I think we've got both of those on the record. Can I just go, Mr. Thompson, to a little bit further more detail about the general fund that you indicated as propping up the $1.083 million loss from the airport last year? How are you balancing that? What way do you see a path forward? Have you made approaches to either the state or the federal government for a response to that reality? And if you don't get a resolution, what does it mean for the people of Wagga Wagga and the region that is served by the airport?
Thank you, Senator. In our particular case, as I said before, we don't own the airport. Our lease with the federal government ends in 2025, so we've only got a few years left. We are currently in discussions with the federal government in relation to whether we continue as a tenant of that airport or whether we withdraw our current involvement and leave it to someone else to run the regional airport, because financially it's not sustainable for us to keep propping up the regional airport in the absence of funding from either the state or the Commonwealth Government, which other regional airports enjoy. We would like to continue running the airport. We see our tier of government, particularly in regional New South Wales, as the best entity to run that airport. But it may surprise some of the committee members that if you enjoy an aircraft trip to Wagga and collect your baggage, we still take that off a small tractor in an area outside the terminal. That it's very much a modest and cheap airport offering at the moment, notwithstanding we're the largest regional capital in inland New South Wales.
A lot of issues there, and I suppose the complication of it is exacerbated somewhat by the intersection with the Australian Defence Force as well. Now, can I go to the councillor, Mr. Hayes? You've indicated, and we've had a number of conversations over the years about the nature of the lease arrangements regarding Wagga Wagga Airport, and there's certainly been plenty of correspondence to the federal government about a satisfactory resolution of this matter. Could you just bring the committee, for the record, up to date with the nature of the lease arrangement, how the council administers it, and correspondence and communication to date through Mr. McCormack to the federal government?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. So the arrangement, as just mentioned previously, is that the airport is owned by Department of Defence, and we're the tenant. So every year we have a formula that then depends on how much traffic goes through. We then pay in our lease, which is around probably about $200,000 a year, but gives or take based on that formula, and that has been different with COVID and with some of the arrangements there. One of the challenges with that is obviously the rent itself, but any upgrades or improvements to the airport that we make increase, I guess, the value of that lease. and has sort of a perverse outcome where we pay for the increase in infrastructure or improvements, which then comes at a greater cost to the rent, where the Department of Defence, acting as the landlord in this case, isn't necessarily meeting obligations that we would like to see to improve that infrastructure and maintain the assets as well, and to help with that. So we've got this situation where, as mentioned just before, attracting grants is very difficult then, because often the grants don't allow to be put forward to what is a government asset. Also attracting businesses, because if they were to build infrastructure on the airport, there's questions around who owns that once the lease expires and it's not renewed. So businesses are unlikely to set up. Our local member, Michael McCormack, has been pretty adamant that he does not want to see the airport ownership given to anyone, let alone Wagga Council, wants it to remain in Department of Defence's hands. The reasons he stated publicly for that is concerns around the RAF base or Department of Defence potentially moving. Significant investment in upgrading the RAF base at the moment. So I'm not entirely sold on that, but I understand no one here wants to see defence goes, or a valuable part of the Wagga community. So any approaches that we've made to look at taking ownership of that airport have been met with, I guess, with resistance from our local member.
Mm. So, I mean, it's a very particular reality in a very particular place, but it does highlight the importance for consideration of this committee of regional airports, in addition to the major flows of business, people movement, and the insecurity of employment that's now part of the entire sector. But it's in the particular that we're finding some of the critical failure points, and that is a failure to resolve this issue that's been going on between the council and the federal government, particularly the Department of Defence. Over how many years has this now been like a thorn in your side that you've been speaking to? I see, Mr. Kendall, you wanted to make a comment there.
Yeah, if I can, I've been a councillor now for 16 years. The current lease was a 30-year lease. When we got to 15 years to run, those discussions with Defence were instigated at that stage, because we knew to keep a viable entity going, that we couldn't allow that uncertainty to continue right to the end of the lease period. Changes of government, I think, have changed. You know, there've been a couple of instances where there's been basically an agreement in place. I think the General Manager might want to speak to that at this stage as well. But then a change of government has basically made the process start again, because a new minister in a new government with new administration would always want to review, you know, where they were up to prior to doing it. So those negotiations are now about 11 years in the run, from my experience.
That's an extraordinary period of time, and it, you know, having been out to Wagga on so many occasions as Labor's duty senator, I look around the community, and it's a robust and resilient community. But I think that $200,000 per year over that period of time could have been very well invested in local community infrastructure. And I still find it extraordinary that the Australian Department of Defence continues to leave Wagga hanging in this degree, with this degree of uncertainty that has real commercial and practical impacts. Mr. Thompson, do you want to speak to what Mr. Kendall was just referring to there?
Yeah, look, I'd like to acknowledge in recent times the representatives from the Department of Defence have been very accessible, and we've had a good dialogue with them in relation to that lease. I certainly recognise that and am grateful for that outcome. It's for the benefit of the senators who may not be familiar. In the early 90s, 230 regional airports were transferred from the Commonwealth to local government authorities. There were 4 airports that were not transferred. In New South Wales, Williamtown was one of those, and we were the other. In recent times, in that discussion we're having with the Department of Defence. We accept that they won't transfer ownership because they still see the Wagga Airport as a strategic asset for the Commonwealth to own, and we would accept that. And the discussions are looking to a longer term lease, which is also an advantage in terms of how we then make an offering for commercial development. The key issue for us in relation to COVID and emerging from COVID is having the Commonwealth bear the cost of actually maintaining that airport, because the base is not a base that uses the runway for training purposes. The council is left to pay all of the costs of maintaining the actual airport part of the facility because the RAF don't use it for training. If we compare ourselves to Williamtown Airport, which was the other New South Wales airport that was not transferred when all the other councils received their airports in the early 90s, that's still a very active RAF base for flight training. And I believe the Commonwealth Government has just contributed to the costs of the actual airport facility there to the tune of $60 million. Now, we certainly don't want $60 million, although I'd gladly accept it if it was offered. However, if we look at the government's contribution to us, since 2005, the total of funding we've received since 2005 is $2.5 million. Yet we're charged in the order of $200,000 every year for the privilege of maintaining the Commonwealth's asset. Now, for us to provide an offering to that business community during COVID and emerging from COVID, councils aren't placed as income earners to actually find that money in a way other than grant funding. We would love to focus the Commonwealth's attention on what it's trying to achieve with regional centres, what those regional centres need to thrive, particularly in a post-COVID environment, and support those initiatives. Communication through transport is clearly one of them. If you look at settlement patterns in England or America, cities of more than 1 million people are unusual. I think England has 2 cities that are more than 1 million people in population. Now, Australia's gone down a radically different path of having population concentrated in particular metropolitan centres, and those airports between the capitals work very cheaply and are a very reliable source of communication between centres. That's not true for regional New South Wales, and we would urge the committee and the Commonwealth Government to rethink what improving the airport connectivity to regional centres might achieve in decentralising the population, because post-COVID it's never been better to live regionally as opposed to in the metropolitan area. Notwithstanding, we sit here with masks and no haircuts just like everybody else.
And I think it's that's why I'm so glad you're actually able to be here, because if there is a structural response to better enabling regional areas to access the services and the quality of support for infrastructure that is necessary going forward in a post-COVID period, mindful of, you know, the health implications that are going to change as a consequence of this, as well as, you know, the situation with jobs, the situation with re-establishing trade connections, and also the post-COVID period of where people actually do start moving around again to connect with one another. You've got a very particular situation there that might not fit a general scheme of response to regional airports because of the particular nature of your relationship with the federal government. So I think it's very important that you have come on today, that the evidence needs to show the particular nature of Wagga's needs, and whatever happens structurally, this will need a particular and careful fix because of your historic intersection with the federal government. Could I just ask, one of the key things of this inquiry and its terms of reference relates to the immediate and long-term impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic response in all sectors that rely on aviation. It highlights tourism, but I know that there's a huge amount of trade movement through your airport as well. Could you speak to what's happened to trade and how the movement of goods and services has been affected in this period and what it is that Wagga needs, the Wagga region through the airport needs going forward. And that might be my last question, Chair. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator. Darryl Woods here. I had to move over because I couldn't quite hear you all in my office. So Wagga Airport is a very important hub and spoke airport. We see that not only through the amount of hire cars that move out of here and people move throughout the regions, but also with respect to the charter aircraft that are flying out of Wagga into different remote and regional locations throughout New South Wales and even further afoot on occasions. So it's a very key part or key aspect of Wagga Airport, along with the I guess the training facilities that are operated by the Australian Airline Pilots Academy. So that's which is without being able to access international pilots has really dropped off in recent times.
Is that business going to be sustained? Because I mean, I know that is a critical training hub there.
Well, I certainly hope it will be sustained, Senator. But, that academy was operating well before, the pilot crisis, the lack of pilot crisis, was borne out by Qantas and others in Australia. So they were sitting there for since 2010 training many pilots, which moved through Rex and then moved into other international and also other domestic carriers. So they're a very, very important source of pilots, not only in Australia, but in some circumstances internationally. So.
Thank you. Yes.
Senator O'Neill.
Mr. Hayes.
Senator Sheldon would like to just ask a few questions if you could please.
Absolutely. I just noticed I think it was Mr. Kendall wanted to say something.
Okay. Do you wish to?
It was just going to be a small comment about the interconnection that major regional airports like Wagga provides into the regional areas. So, for example, I think banks today still need to have all of their documents transferred overnight and that in the southern area and southwestern area of this state occurs through Wagga Airport. Wagga Airport is also a major hub for charter services. For example, if we needed to fly to another regional centre within New South Wales on scheduled flights, it takes somewhere between half a day and 3/4 of a day, say, to get to Tamworth from Wagga. But with a direct charter out of the airport, you could be in Tamworth 2 hours later or an hour and a half later via a normal charter. That's a fairly critical job or a fairly critical function that we see pre-COVID was increasing on a year-on-year basis. That interregional charter flight business is becoming a very, very as regional centres grow, is becoming a pretty good business model, that's serving a need within the regional community. Where we go after COVID will be interesting now that we've got better used to using these types of connection services. But from what we've seen in the between the first COVID and this second phase of COVID was that most of that travel returned very quickly once the community opened up. So it's a critical need for regional areas to continue to function, is to have this air travel services both through regular public transport and through charter services.
Thanks, Senator McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Kendall. I'll go to Senator Sheldon for the 5 minutes we have left for the inquiry. Senator Sheldon.
Good, thanks very much, Chair. First of all, I just want to say I've flown into Wagga Airport on a number of occasions and have certainly driven down to Wagga. It's a beautiful area. You're in a great part of the country. But one of the things that struck me at the airport is to keep that vital part of infrastructure, community infrastructure going, that there needs some federal government actions. And can you just outline the actions that the federal government needs to take? I know you've raised some monetary questions, but if you might just sort of step us through.
Thank you, Senator. The pressing issue for us is we have a very small terminal, and I won't repeat what's been said before in relation to that. However, the federal government, through its regulations, are imposing new screening requirements on all regional airports. For us to meet those screening requirements, we actually have to increase the size of our terminal, because one carrier is subject to screening, the second carrier is not subject to screening, and the footprint for the existing building is too small to house the new screening equipment. The federal government are not funding the new building or the new area required to house that screening equipment. So what the federal government is essentially saying to us at the moment is, we will lease you an airport and a terminal. We will impose on you the costs of maintaining all of the assets at that facility. We will impose on you a rental fee in the order of $200,000. We'll then change the regulations so that you have to change your screening requirement for half of the passengers that leave. The second carrier is not subject to those screening requirements, and we will pay for you to for the new equipment, but we won't pay for you to build us a new building to house that equipment in, because of course we own the building because it's our land and you're only a tenant. To us, that's untenable. Our immediate need is for the government to take a more reasonable approach to our airport in relation to meeting the costs of that new screening equipment, noting that when 230 airports were transferred in the 90s, we were one of 4 that weren't, and we'd just like to be recognised that we're in a slightly different situation to all the other large regionals that are putting in screening equipment but enjoying funding from the state government, which is not coming to us because it's Commonwealth asset.
Look, thanks very much for that. I noted the evidence you gave before that there's been only $2.5 million in grants to upgrade the airport since, if I understood correctly, 2005. Yet there's an annual cost of $200,000, which, if I calculate correctly, is $3.2 million that you've actually paid the government, but you've only received $2.5 million. You've given us evidence about the importance to the Riverina, the airport is. It's an economic hub. And you're now telling us that the new facility building that you're going to be required to build is going to be owned lock, stock and barrel by your those that own your land, the lessor. This seems a quite incredible situation to find, that the government has put you in this position. It seems incongruous to making sure that we have a viable aviation, economically viable aviation industry down there. What impact do you think that if there wasn't these new facilities, and note the costs you've outlined, plus the impact if the government doesn't provide additional funding to both the facilities and also giving you the capacity to further expand when necessary the airport?
Do you want me to handle that?
That'd be fine, thank you.
I'm happy to give
Thank
my part of the answer to that.
Thank you, Councillor Kendall.
Frankly, we can't afford to do that airport terminal extension and install the legislated required security arrangements for federal government. Then I'm not sure that we can continue to offer the services that require that. I'm certain we can't continue to offer that airline service because it's an absolute requirement of the federal government. Keep in mind there's 3 years to run on this lease and that hasn't yet been resolved. So that in addition to what Mr. Thompson outlined, I would say one of the most critical current needs is the finalisation of a new lease for that airport. It needs to be, and I think that there is some agreement in principle, it needs to be a long-term lease with a long-term option so that the relevant investment can be made from an operational point of view. For example, if we've even had issues in the last 12 months that we've had to resolve from a depreciation point of view. With only 3 years to run on the airport, if we invested let's say, $5 million into a taxiways, then they would have to be depreciated over the remaining life of the airport lease, potentially, rather than on the remaining life of those taxiways and that investment.
Yeah.
So the lease is a critical part that needs to be resolved very, very quickly.
Chair, can I
Thank you,
just
Mr.
ask a
Kemp.
question on notice? Sorry, Senator.
Sorry, I'll just go to Senator Sheldon first, and then I'll go to you, Senator O'Neill.
I was just going to say, Mr. Kendall, before I hand it back to the chair, but if there's another question there, I just wanted to say that it does seem incredible that such an important facility as the airport at Wagga and the critical nature of it for the Riverina area. I know how important it is. I've been there often enough to see it firsthand as well. It's disturbing to think that there's this degree of uncertainty where the whole community has to pay the price, and both of the uncertainty, but also pay the price when there's certainty. There needs to be some sharing of that load across the community. But sorry, back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Sheldon. Senator O'Neill, did you?
I'm just mindful of the time, so I wanted to put a question on notice if I could. I'm very concerned about the evidence we've received this afternoon about the general fund propping up the loan to the tune of over $1 million. I wonder if you could provide us with some more detail about that and what financial path of resolution you are pursuing. Also, with regard to point F of the terms of reference, it says what policy and practical measures would be required to assist the industry to recover in the medium term. In terms of the medium-term recovery, particularly for Wagga, given the unique situation that you're in, would you be able to write to this committee and perhaps write to me separately as well as the Labor Duty Senator? What are the measures along the lines of what Senator Sheldon was just saying that you are required to assist the development and the maintenance of the aviation industry and all the services it provides in the Wagga Wagga region? To be very specific in exactly what you need in the medium term to make this work.
Thank you, Senator O'Neill. Could I just alert the witnesses from Wagga City Council that we need questions on notice by the 20th of September? So are you comfortable to take those questions on notice from Senator O'Neill?
Yes, Chair, we'll be able to respond within that time.
Okay. I'd like to thank each of you for appearing before us this afternoon, and also to all those witnesses who have given evidence to us today. The committee will hold its next hearing as part of this inquiry on Wednesday at 9:30 Australian Eastern Standard Time. But for now, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you.